A special kind of silence always reigned at the city cemetery, a mournful silence, on which the outside world had no effect. Gloria Dixon sighed sadly and walked over to her daughter's grave. Jessica died 10 days ago, but the grieving mother still couldn't accept the fact that she was gone. Burying one's own child is always difficult, especially at that age. You were only 40. You had your whole life ahead of you, but now you're gone. It's that job of yours, with all the worrying and lack of rest. Your heart simply couldn't take it, the woman whispered, going up to the grave. Wiping away her tears, Mrs. Dixon saw that grass had already sprouted in some places. She knew it would be best to weed it now, before it got out of hand. The woman also knew that the cemetery caretakers weren't very diligent about it and preferred to have the families clean the graves of their loved ones. Stefan did his best. I should thank him. This fence is really nice and it goes around 2 spots. Very thoughtful. He probably reserved the second spot for himself. The poor man loved Jessica so much, Mrs. Dixon whispered after examining the metal structure. Since it had rained recently and the weather was warm and calm, there was a lot of fresh grass on the grave. Leaning over the grave, the old woman started weeding it inch by inch. It wasn't easy because the weeds had already taken root. As luck would have it, the sun was already high in the sky, and the air had warmed up and it was getting very hard to breathe. Having finished with the grass, Mrs. Dixon leaned against the fence to take a break for a couple of minutes. Suddenly, she heard a strange sound somewhere nearby. The old woman shuddered and looked around. There wasn't anyone there except for a pair of goldfinches perched on a branch of an old willow. But the sound didn't resemble the chirping of birds. It was actually more like, "Dear God, that's a human voice," Gloria Dixon whispered. Having leaned over the grave, the woman managed to distinguish a couple of phrases. "I'm still alive. Somebody help me." Mrs. Dixon was shocked by what she heard. Of course, the woman didn't think for a second that her daughter Jessica could still be alive. Maybe it's a double burial. It does happen sometimes that another person gets buried in someone else's grave, the woman thought, as if trying to convince herself. Realizing that she didn't have any time to waste, Mrs. Dixon hurried to find the cemetery caretakers. Robert and Simon Simpson were brothers. They'd been working at the cemetery for quite some time. They were used to getting paid good money for their services, so they weren't willing to do anything for free. For this reason, the old woman's story about the sounds coming from the grave didn't arouse much interest in the men. Over the years they'd worked at the cemetery, they'd already seen and heard a lot and were used to the fact that the relatives of the deceased often told them strange things. Usually, all the brothers had to do was calm down the relatives and take them to the grave, point at the date of death, and remind them that their loved ones were definitely no longer alive. But this elderly woman was more persistent than anyone before her. Having exchanged a meaningful look with Simon, Robert shrugged and followed the old woman. Having approached the grave, the cemetery worker asked defiantly, "So, what next?" Gloria Dixon was ready for that question and immediately told the man to bend over the grave mound and take a listen. Simon grimaced and did as the old woman suggested. The man couldn't hear anything at first, but about a minute later, he did hear someone's muffled scream. Simon turned pale, but still managed to pull himself together and immediately tried to turn the situation around. "Okay, I did hear something, but how do I know what it was? Maybe that's just a rat. Or maybe a fox. They do come here once in a while. But it doesn't mean that we should dig up every grave. At least not for free." Fortunately, Mrs. Dixon immediately took the gravedigger's hint. She got her purse and pulled out $100. Simon sighed in disappointment and couldn't help but say caustically, "Ma'am, but there are 2 of us." Gloria Dixon didn't haggle and pulled another 100 out of her purse. Moreover, she promised the man another 100 if they were to start right now. Sensing the chance to earn some easy money, the men quickly grabbed their shovels and got down to business. Since the grave was fresh, it wasn't hard to dig it up. It was then that the men made a hole in the ground, which was formed when the supports from the iron fence were installed. It was through this improvised ventilation duct that the air entered the grave. Apparently, when Gloria Dixon's son-in-law installed the fence, he pushed the pipes in too deep, thus accidentally creating an air conduit in the coffin. But when the shuffles of the gravediggers hit the wood, they knew they'd reached their goal. "What are you waiting for? Open it," Gloria Dixon ordered. When the men finally did, all three of them were surprised beyond words. As it turned out, Jessica was still alive, although she was on the verge of physical exhaustion and dehydration. Having called the ambulance and the police, Mrs. Dixon still couldn't believe it was all actually happening. Soon, Jessica was already in the intensive care unit of the local hospital, where she was immediately put on drips and her blood was taken for testing. As it turned out a little later, the autopsy required in such cases wasn't performed on the woman, and the burial itself wasn't exactly well organized. Apparently, someone wanted to get rid of Jessica as soon as possible, thus making sure that the traces of poison in her blood were never found. But who would do something like that? I should probably ask my son-in-law. Tell him the good news, Miss Dixon said cautiously to the police officer. That's exactly what you shouldn't do. Let's not rush things for now and keep your daughter's resurrection secret. I think it could help save her life, the officer said. Shrugging her shoulders, the old woman decided to follow the officer's advice and went home. However, Mrs. Dixon still couldn't understand who would want to kill her daughter. Sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, the old woman tried to analyze the situation. But she didn't have much time for that. Soon, the door of the old woman's house swung open and her son-in-law, Stefan, came inside. The young man wanted to spend time with his mother-in-law so that she wouldn't feel so lonely. He even brought her a small cake and a bottle of drink. Mrs. Dixon was very tempted to tell her son-in-law that his wife was literally risen from the dead. But then she remembered the police officer's warning and kept her mouth shut. Moreover, Stefan suddenly started behaving somewhat strangely. As he finished pouring a drink into the glass, he tried to get Gloria Dixon out of the kitchen under some strange pretext. At first, he asked for a towel, then a fruit snack, and even an ashtray. At some point, Mrs. Dixon caught herself thinking that Stefan was behaving like that for a reason. Having decided to learn the truth and find out the reason behind Stefan's strange behavior, the woman went into the hall, pretending that she needed napkins. However, she didn't go anywhere and spied on Stefan through a slightly opened kitchen door. As soon as Stefan was left alone in the kitchen, he looked around the room anxiously and reached into his pocket for some reason. The man pulled out a vial with some strange yellowish substance. Having removed the cap, Stefan tilted the flask over Mrs. Dixon's glass and poured about half of its contents into it. At that moment, everything fell into place in the old woman's head. It happens when a piece of the puzzle is missing. It prevents one from seeing the whole picture. But when it's found, everything becomes clear as day. So that's what it is. It must be poison. And there I was wondering why Stefan installed the fence around 2 grave spots at once. The second spot was intended for me, the old woman thought and locked the kitchen door. Hey, what are you doing, Mrs. Dixon? Are you all right? Stefan said when he heard the key turn into the lock. But the old woman couldn't hear his last words because she was already calling the police. Having realized that the truth was out, Stefan howled in anger and then drank the contents of the glass intended for his mother-in-law. The man's head immediately started spinning and he started seeing strange lights dancing in front of him. Stefan fell down on the floor. At that moment, he was ready to meet his maker and answer for all the bad things that he had done in his life. But, contrary to his expectations, the man would first have to go before the earthly court, and only then before the heavenly one. Stefan survived thanks to the paramedics who quickly arrived at the scene after Gloria Dixon called them. Stefan got his stomach pumped and an antidote drip. Thus, the man escaped certain death. According to the police investigation, Stefan's motive was all about money. The man decided to get his hands on all of his wife's financial assets, but then he quickly realized that in the event of Jessica's death, Gloria Dixon would also receive part of the inheritance. Thus, the man decided to poison his wife first, and then her mother. Stefan bought a potent poisonous substance on the black market, which was supposed to cause paralysis and cardiac arrest. However, the unfortunate killer was in such a rush that he brought Jessica to the morgue when she was still alive. Nevertheless, the pathologist confirmed her death, after getting a hefty bribe, of course. The funeral was organized in record time, but that didn't happen without bribing some important people. The only thing that the man couldn't have anticipated was that the poison wouldn't be strong enough. It was thanks to that fact that Jessica came to her senses after the funeral and managed to breathe through the pipe that served as a support for the metal fence. Of course, if Gloria Dixon hadn't come to clean her daughter's grave, this story would have had a more tragic ending. Thus, Mrs. Dixon didn't only manage to avoid her own death, but she also saved her daughter and even punished the criminal, who showed incredible ingenuity and almost managed to get away with his plan. Now that the imminent threat to Jessica's life had passed, she started enjoying life again, believing that one day she will meet her soulmate, who'd bring love, respect, and mutual understanding into her life.